Hi everyone, this is the second PowerPoint about the rise and fall of disco, and we're going to start in this one talking about the popularity of Studio 54, some of the controversies surrounding it, some of the controversies about disco music in general, and then we're going to look at the popularity and the impact of the film and the soundtrack, Saturday Night Fever. Then we'll take a quick look at the backlash against disco that contributed to its decline. So let's dig in. Studio 54 was arguably the most famous disco in the United States, located in Manhattan and New York City. For fans of disco, it came to represent the glamour, the glitziness, the appeal of disco. Detractors saw it representing the snobbery of disco, a place where celebrities hung out and you had to have the right sort of appearance, the right clothes, the right hairstyle, the right shoes to be admitted. In fact, you had to purchase a membership to even have a chance of being admitted to Studio 54. And this scene of people thronging outside the doors at 3 a.m., hoping to be selected by those working the notorious velvet rope in front of the entrance to Studio 54, reflected its popularity. Studio 54 was controversial for a variety of reasons. One was the fact that it was welcoming to people regardless of sexual orientation. So it was space where gays and lesbians felt safe at a time when the gay rights movement was still just getting started, and it was not easy coming out in the 1970s. Another aspect of it that was controversial dealt with the frequently open use of drugs in Studio 54, even on the dance floor. And the rise of disco coincided with the growing popularity of recreational use of the drug cocaine, which had been around for a long time, but came into more widespread use in the 70s. And at Studio 54, as you can see from this photograph, not only was drug use not hidden or discouraged, in fact, it was celebrated with this gimmick they had, the man in the moon, the Coke spoon to its nose that would be lowered over the dance floor at midnight. So as they said, drug use wasn't discouraged, cocaine specifically, but in fact was embraced as part of the fun and frivolity of the 1970s. I mentioned Studio 54 being a place where gays and lesbians felt welcomed, and one of the sub-themes in disco was the growing prominence as DJs, producers, and as artists of gay and lesbian performers. Probably the best-known example of this was the group The Village People, who had these hit songs like YMCA and In the Navy, that were really quite clever and went over the heads of a lot of people in the 70s who didn't understand what was going on in these songs, which I think is still true today. The Village People were probably the campiest example of a gay act that enjoyed tremendous popularity during the height of disco. And the other thing that happens that contributes to disco becoming as big as it was the release of the film Saturday Night Fever, with the film and the soundtrack becoming huge hits. Robert Stigwood, who was a film producer and also manager of the group The Bee Gees, read this cover story in New York Magazine by a writer named Nick Cohn, Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night, which was published as a first-person account of the disco scene in New York City at that time. In fact, Cohn made up this entire article, although that didn't come to light until several years later. But Stigwood read this article, thought it would be a great basis for a film, have a kid from Brooklyn whose life centers around getting dressed up, going out and dancing on Saturday night, and had the Bee Gees, who had been around since the late 60s and had a number of hits in the late 60s, early 70s. then kind of fell out of popularity, and they were just starting to make a comeback and had released a couple disco-influenced albums beginning in 1975. But he wanted them to write music specifically for the film Saturday Night Fever, so they kind of knew the outline of the story, but the film was still in production while they were doing this music. And it's just one of those examples of serendipity where the songs ended up fitting the film perfectly. So the film Saturday Night Fever was released in 77. It's a movie, I would argue, that has not aged very well. It's very much a timepiece film. There are some things about it I think are still compelling, but other elements of it are dated and in some cases downright offensive. It's a film with heavy doses of sexism that was considered acceptable at this point still in the 1970s. It really launched John Travolta's career, and the movie and the soundtrack became huge hits. At one point, the Bee Gees had 5 songs in the top 10 on the top 40 charts, and no group had done that since the Beatles in the 1960s. So Saturday Night Fever really mainstreams disco, broadens its appeal to a much wider audience. So more white people start listening to disco music. And 77, 78, you see disco becoming dominant in the top 40 charts. There are radio stations that switch to all disco format. A lot of fans of traditional rock music who didn't like disco stylistically now became even more concerned that it was subsuming, taking over, and maybe even replacing traditional rock and roll. When anything becomes this popular within pop culture, it's inevitable that there's going to be pushback, and that's what happened with disco. I played you part of this performance by the comedian Steve Martin on Saturday Night Live, who unveiled a song, King Tut, which he really intended to be a satirical kind of jab at a traveling exhibit of artifacts from the tomb of the Egyptian boy king, King Tutankhamun. I can't even say his name. Tutankhamun, popularly known as King Tut, because most people like me have trouble saying his correct Egyptian name. But this became a #1 hit, and it reflected the fact that there was an audience eager to make fun, mock, and ridicule disco. Similarly, this DJ from LA, Rick Dees, had a #1 hit with one of the worst songs ever, Disco Duck, which was a person who wasn't even Rick Dees. It was somebody else doing a lame Donald Duck impersonation over a watered-down disco beat. Mad Magazine joined in, satirizing Saturday Night Fever, and this all started in 1979. The key event, and one still surrounded in controversy, came in the summer of 79 when the infamous disco demolition riot happened at the stadium of the Chicago White Sox baseball team. This was the old Comiskey Park in the summer of 1979. 1979, the White Sox were terrible. They were drawing frequently fewer than 10,000 fans per game. And there was a popular DJ in Chicago, a guy named Steve Dahl, who had been the #1 DJ on the #1 FM rock station in Chicago. When that station switched to a disco format, depending on whose story you believe, Dahl either quit or was fired, went to a rival station where he began a relentless campaign against disco music under the motto, "Disco Sucks." He became very popular, especially with teenage listeners in Chicago. He was friends with the son of the owner of the White Sox, and he suggested this idea that during a planned doubleheader that summer against the Detroit Tigers, that people could get in for 98 cents. 98 was the point at the dial where his new station was located on the FM radio dial. You could get in for 98 cents if you bought or brought a disco record of some sort with you. And these records would be collected, put in a big bin, blown up, and this would be done between games of the doubleheader. Here you see a couple typical fans. There was a woman photographer in Chicago who took a lot of pictures of this event before and during. And this is typical of what you see. White males, this guy's wearing his Judas Priest t-shirt, t-shirts with Judas Priest, AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, these traditional, white heavy rock bands. These are their fans turning out in support of Dahl's anti-disco movement. You could see even the cameraman for the local TV station joined in. When this event happened after the first game of the doubleheader, the explosion that they set off was larger than expected and started a fire in the outfield. And fans poured onto the field and did so much damage that the second game ended up being canceled. We don't even know for certain how many people turned out, but estimates are as many as 70,000. They quit letting people in, but people were scaling the outside of the building on ropes. You can see in this picture, which is kind of hazy because of the smoke from the explosion, people are charging onto the field, but you can tell that even the upper deck is still absolutely packed. Some people have categorized this as a racist, homophobic event in the fact that the majority of disco artists were black. As I said, there was prominent gay and lesbian performers as part of the disco movement. And that's an interesting subject to debate. I think it would have been impossible, say, if a black DJ had tried to organize an event like this and said, Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, these white rock bands suck. Bring all their records and we'll blow them up and burn them. It wouldn't have gone over. Steve Dahl has always denied that he was, racist or homophobic. He definitely was an ass and still is to an extent. So it was an extremely controversial event and reflected the depth of antipathy that some people felt toward disco. So later that year, when Michael Jackson's impactful, influential first solo album, Off the Wall, comes out, he and producer Quincy Jones back away from calling this disco music and instead term it dance music, and other artists were going to take that cue as well. And I would say it's not that disco ever went away entirely. Its influence can be seen throughout the 80s. With techno-pop that arose even in New Wave, which had a heavy emphasis on dance. Performers like Madonna and Prince were among those whose music reflected disco influence, but use of the term disappeared and was replaced by the term dance music. So what I said in class was that the rise and fall of disco, I would argue, reflects the growing multiculturalism of American popular culture in the 1970s. And the intensity of the reaction to it really reflects the kind of transformative effect that popular music and the styles associated with can have. And this is one of the important contributions of disco, that it really gives greater prominence and higher visibility to people in previously marginalized communities, in particular gay and lesbian Americans in the music industry. And I said this ranged from people being DJs to club owners. Steve Rubel, one of the co-owners of Studio 54, was gay. Recording artists, producers who were producing the music. All of these were examples of the impact of disco music.